This is the second video in my solo RPG tutorial series. You do not need to have watched the first video before watching this one, but there is a link to it below if you want to see how we got to this stage. In this video, we're going to be talking about wilderness generation, how you go from a blank page or a blank map to creating a wilderness for your character or party to wander through. Where we left off in the first video was we got a general sense here of that we have some characters. They're going to be moving through this outdoor environment, which we're going to talk about here. They have a basic goal and they have a basic time frame. Again, not necessary to know any of that for this video, which will be general principles of wilderness generation, but if you want to know the specific references I'm making, you can go back and see how we got here. I'm going to be demonstrating one way to generate a wilderness, and obviously it's not the only way. It's a way that I find useful because it offers a lot of direction as well as a lot of freedom and helps me move forward and not just kind of get lost wandering around in my own wilderness, as it were, to create this story. And to do this, the first thing that I need to do is figure out, how am I coming up with the terrain types? What are they? Where am I getting them from? And how do I keep my character moving into a new terrain type and dealing with that? Once I have that general thing mapped out, then I need to figure out how to populate those terrain types with various enemies and NPCs and perhaps environmental situations like ruins or whatever that will generate encounters as the character or characters move through. In this case, it's just one character. And so that's sort of populating that terrain. And then a little bit more granular than that, I need to think about how I'm going to deal with the weather, for example, how I'm going to deal with things like survival or my rations or whatever, to add more layers onto the experience. Of course, you don't need to do all of this in a wilderness. You could simply have your character be outside and wandering through one type of terrain and have it be another type of terrain or whatever, and not deal with issues of the weather or the survival. It's really, obviously, it's up to you. Everything's up to you. But for this demonstration, I want to talk about getting a little bit more detailed. And then along with this and the terrain types coming together is the issue of how this terrain is going to impact travel and travel time. And as I've mentioned elsewhere, I think the issue of time and managing time and the implications of passing time can be a little bit challenging, at least for me, to deal with. So I'm going to show you some basic ways that I have of dealing with that. Not too complicated, but to give, again, another added level to the realism of what is being outside in an environment and dealing with those types of conditions. So on the matter of terrain types, there are a couple ways to go, and one is simply to find a product or an online generator. I do everything with analog or physical copies of things. I don't like to work with anything on the computer when I'm playing a game like this, but of course there's a million resources out there for that. I don't know what they are because I don't use them, but I know that they exist. For random generation of tables and things, I've recommended this tome of adventure design before. It's kind of my go-to book on it, and there is in here, in book 4, an entire non-dungeon adventure design area with wilderness adventures. So you can see here that there are tables to roll on that could generate various types of terrain, and then within the terrain some animals and other features of things that you could go to. I'm not going to do that for this video, and I'm not going to do that for this little adventure I'm creating. Why? Well, I think that's a pretty obvious thing. I don't need to demo that. What I want to do and what I want to demo is something I talked about in my video on easy ways to be your own GM, and you can see the link to that below, which is how to use other things that you may have to help you in your GMing for solo RPG, and specifically other board games that you may have. And even more specifically, in this case, we're talking about wilderness adventures using maybe maps or tiles or things that you have from other games to be what you travel through in your adventure. And here for this video, I'm going to go to a classic, Outdoor Survival, and I'm partially doing this because as some of you know, in the original D&D, this game was referenced as part of the equipment as needed to play the original D&D, and what was meant by that was this map here. So Outdoor Survival is an Avalon Hill game. I talked about this or demonstrated this in another video. Can't easily find the date here, but I'll put that up. And what is key to this is that it has this map, and the map originally came in 3 parts. The copy that I got has been taped together by a user, and in fact you could see here a little bit the original user or some prior user that me has drawn in even an extra trail. So this is hand drawn here, this trail. There's some numbering down here that is also drawn in by an original user. I am going to show you how I use this map to help me generate the various terrains that my character goes through. And I'm going to reference the mapboard movement chart here for a couple of things. One, it's going to give me the breakdown of the different types of terrain. It's also going to suggest to me how difficult it is to move through that terrain, and I'm going to bring that into my own story to have an impact both on the time it will take me to travel and also who or what I will encounter when traveling. So once I decided to do this, I then went to the basic fantasy rulebook that I have and also the additional monster manual that I have, the field guide. And I flipped through these and I chose, based on the terrain type that I know that my character is going to be in, I chose encounters or enemies that would be in that terrain, and I just wrote them down. I did this thematically a little bit, so we have like the wood golem in the woods or the rough. I've got a banshee in the desert. I've got shadows and wolves in the mountains. I've got, I stuck the gelatinous cube into the swamp because I thought that would be, that's sort of cool, imagining some gelatinous cube forming out of swamp water. And in the clear, I didn't get too much for the clear. I just got an air and earth elemental, so I'm not sure how I'm going to really deal with that. I simply chose the things that were interesting to me. So I didn't spend a whole lot of time figuring out making it equal. I just wrote down the things that interested me or that I wanted to potentially encounter. I didn't realize until I had finished that at somewhere in one of these references here is a really handy chart that shows how difficult the monsters are to deal with. It lists them by hit dice. So had I thought about that, I'm dealing with a first level character, I might have tried to stick to lower level monsters. I didn't do that, and in fact I noticed this giant orb of eyes, which is kind of cool, has like a lot of hit points, so I put that in a bracket and probably will not encounter that. I didn't really look up the rest. My story, and this is true of many things I run for myself, is going to be, in addition to the larger story of this cleric who is waiting for us or trying to, we have this holy symbol we're trying to bring to him, we are going to be just picking up treasure along the way because that's fun, I like it, and hopefully some of this treasure might help us deal with some of these larger encounters that are waiting for us. Nevertheless, I just chose the things that interested me. I then counted them up to see how many were in each area, and based on the frequency or the amount, I kind of came up with a chart here that's going to indicate the likelihood of the encounter happening when I'm in that area. So for example, the woods had the most potential encounter, so I gave that a 60% chance of there being an encounter if we're in the woods. And then based off of that, I just went down, and there's 50% chance in the mountains, 40% in the desert, the river 30%, and clear only 20%, because I didn't get a lot from that, for example, on the clear when I was going through the field guide. This is all, again, just something that I created. I think having this type of percentile chance of encounter makes it easy when you're moving through. You can simply roll your D100 and see, oh yes, I got, there's a 60% chance of an encounter. I'm having an encounter in the woods. Then I can go to the woods, and there's 10 wood encounters, so I can roll my D10 to see what it is going to be. Another way of doing this is to have your list here and simply be rolling, say, a D20 for everything. And then, since you only have 10, if you roll a 1 to 10, you have the encounter. If you roll an 11 to 20, you don't. Or same thing with the mountains, you've only got 6 encounters, etc. That obviously will build in the relative percentages for you. So there's a couple ways to do that. There's other ways to do it, but those are two of the more obvious ways to do that. I also neglected to mention here, there's trails in the map here. We can see them down here. And I also have the trails encounter. Now, I decided that I was going to have a couple of different situations with trails. There's either going to be a sort of empty trail that has a 20% chance of having some kind of remnant of something there, and the remnant is basically going to be a treasure, and we'll get to that. Or there's going to be a 20% chance of coming across a ruin, and if there's a ruin there, there's going to be an 80% chance of having a remnant. So I added something a little into the trail mixture there that will be an additional roll to see what the situation is with the trail. Of course, you could continue to go further and further with this. For example, with the woods. I simply had the woods in the rough because I was basically following the direction or the suggestion of the map that we're going to be wandering around. But you could, if you wanted to make this even more granular, you could have deep woods, you could have light woods. Similarly, with the mountains, you could have hills, you could have mountains, you could have cliffs, etc. It's really up to you for this demonstration, and frankly for something I would just be doing on my own off camera. I try to have a balance between enough variability that I can feel like things are different, I can feel like I'm generating some sort of story, and I can feel like the encounters that I have are related to the environment I'm in, and something that's so detailed that I'm basically just creating a million different tables and exceptions and whatever, and just rolling and rolling and rolling on them before actually I do anything else aside from rolling on them. There's nothing wrong with that, and sometimes I'll just take a book and just roll up some random stuff because that's kind of fun and enjoyable, but it doesn't progress necessarily to a story or an adventure. And the part of the progression is what I try to also build in before I start, so that I am actually having some pull toward I don't want to say an end, but a different state than when I started. Here's a look at more or less the whole map, and when I play this, I will have the whole map open and travel around it. For the demo, I'm just going to show you how it works, but I want to focus on this first of all. This is the random direction note here, and obviously you wouldn't necessarily need this, but it helps because I'm going to be using this. I'm going to place my character in the middle. And again, this is just the demo here. What I'm going to do, and I've experimented with this a little, and I think when doing this type of, as it were, GM prep for yourself, you'll have to realize that you might need to experiment a little bit. I'm going to be rolling a D6, first of all, to generate the direction as per this indicator here, and then I decided I was going to generate a distance traveled using another die, and I started out with 2 D6s, but that wasn't enough radius out because I was ending up sort of in the same place if I rolled 2 in a row. Then I went to a D8. I think probably a D10 is the way to go, and I just brought out my favorite D10 to show you. This is somewhat contemporaneous to the map here. I realize the map is from 1972, and cool. Won't use it for video because you can't read it, but I love this. Anyway, I put my character here in the middle of the map, and I'm going to be rolling these two dice to see what happens. So the number 5 is going to be the direction, which in this case will be in this direction, and the 6 is going to be the distance. So I would move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, still moving still remaining in the forest. I would have my encounter or whatever was happening there, and then when it was time to move on, I would roll again, and I get the new direction. Now this is interesting. In this particular case, I'm again going back where I started from, so I'm basically going back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The reason this is okay is we're only using this to generate the terrain, the environment. We're not playing on this map. So this is off to the side. What this says to me is like we're still wandering. Whatever that encounter was, we're still wandering through the forest. And we have our next encounter or whatever, however we're marking off time. And whoops, we roll again. And that was a 2 for distance and a 4 for direction. So now we're moving south and we're only moving 2. So finally we've been wandering in the forest and we come out into the clear. We have whatever happens here, and we move on. And we're now moving again back in this direction, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we're coming to the edge of the mountains. You can see that this is just one way of doing it. It's really not that different than just continuing to roll on a random table. I find it enjoyable because I like to see and have some suggestion here of, for example, we landed on this hex, so we have the suggestion that we're just entering the mountains. It gives a little bit of a beginning to help me fill out the story. And I talked about this again in a number of videos, most especially the video on easy ways to be your own GM, using board game materials to provide some scaffolding and suggestion of narrative can be very helpful to continue to move forward with your story. So this is an example of how this map is used, and we will see it further in future videos when I'm actually doing the gameplay. But if you have any type of board game that has an outdoor type of map and it is either a quad based or hex based, you could use it in this way. If you have something like say Touch of Evil, for example, which is outdoors but it has just the movement to movement, it'd be a little harder to do it. I suppose you could do it measuring with a ruler. I can't remember off the top of my head how differentiated that environment is. There's swamps and bogs and things. That might be too narrow, but you could look into your game closet and see whether there is anything like this that you could use if you wanted to do something a little bit different than just a random table. The last thing I'm going to talk about here is what I think of as perhaps, say, window dressing, and that is the further leveling of impacts and conditions onto your basic environment, which would be just the terrain. And this has to do with things like the day and the night. Will you be keeping track of that, and how? What will the impact of day or night be? The weather, and again, the impact of that on encounters or travel. I tend to think of the weather as impacting travel and day and night as impacting encounters, but this is just, obviously not a science. And then this overall question of time management and rest and things of that nature. These are, you can get, or I can get, a little bit overly complicated here and lose my way a little bit in figuring out exactly how I'm going to manage it. And I'm just showing you some of the notes I made here. I haven't quite settled on this, but I tried to do a little bit of a weather chart, and then what would the impact of the various weather be? Would it be an impact on rations? So for example, if it was very cold, would I need to consume more rations? If it was very windy, would it take me more to move? Again, this is very board game oriented, of course, stating the obvious, but I will state the obvious. I recognize this. For me, when I am creating some type of adventure here, I like that. I like little things to keep track of when I'm the one deciding what they're going to be. So for example here, I was kind of mapping out in my, the first video you saw that I have 1 week of rations. That's how it was defined in the basic fantasy. It wasn't really defined beyond that. So I was trying to figure out, all right, well, what does this mean in terms of how I'm consuming things? Is it going to be a certain consumption per hour? How am I going to be tracking it? I tend not to like to track too much temporally in terms of hours, and certainly the passage of time in a combat round and things like that. For myself, I find that to be onerous as opposed to interesting. However, at the slightly more macro level, I do want there to be time pressure on me to either get to that cleric, or to perhaps get to or find a retainer who's going to take me to the cleric. I don't know. It's that part of the story is going to unfold. But I do need to figure out how I'm going to have enough of a external pressure to continue to move forward, as well as having that external pressure relate to the general condition here, which is that I'm outside. So those are some of the things that that I need to think about further. Let's go back to what the overall outline here and see. We've covered the terrain types and how we're going to generate them. I've showed you how I set up the encounters. What we've left a little bit undetermined in terms of the specifics of how I'm going to do it is this window dressing, the weather, the survival, the time passage. But these are things that if you wanted to go a little bit deeper in terms of your creation of wilderness, that you could then think about. Weather could simply be a table that you create with rolling on that table with different weather conditions that you predetermine how it will impact you. And survival can be either just abstracted totally, that it's not a factor in your game, there's no issues with logistics or supplies or anything like that, or that could be factored into your adventure quite heavily, where you need to forage for food, or if you come to a river, you need to do fishing and things like that. Again, it is obviously up to you. Those types of activities are not what I tend to focus on, but I do want some type of broader measure. And again, finally, the travel and the overall time. I had said in the first video, I wanted to give myself a week to obtain the goal, which is either to get to the cleric, or now in my mind I'm thinking perhaps it would be to meet up with somebody who I will be able to hire. I had this as a written down earlier as a lighter goal to hire a retainer, maybe before 7 days. Is my food running out? Not all questions can be settled, obviously, before you begin, because this is not a board game. It's an unfolding adventure. And in this particular case, it's an adventure in the wilderness. And I hope that this video gave you some tips on how to go from this type of blank page to a wilderness environment that feels real.